You're listening to Nutrition Matters podcast with Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist. Nutrition Matters podcast explores how to approach food and your body in a whole new way. I interview people who share stories and expertise in rejecting diet culture, making peace with food, and discovering a more positive, realistic, and sustainable approach to health and well-being. I'm Paige Smathers, registered dietitian nutritionist, and owner of Positive Nutrition, an in-person nutrition therapy practice in Salt Lake City, Utah. I offer free resources, including this podcast, a blog, and posts on social media. If you're local to Salt Lake City, check out our services and availability for appointments, and keep your eyes out for in-person groups on mindfulness, intuitive eating, body image resilience, and more. Go to positive-nutrition.com and hit subscribe if you'd like to keep in touch. I also offer online courses covering topics like the science of nutrition, mindfulness, and healing your relationship with food. Check those out at positive-nutrition.com/academy. If you like what you hear on the podcast, you can make a difference by leaving a review, sharing with friends and family, or making a donation. Thank you so much for your support. You can also find me on Instagram or Facebook if you'd like to have a little more food for thought at Paige Smathers RD. Thank you so much for listening. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Nutrition Matters podcast. As always, I'm thrilled to be with you today and so excited to share this podcast episode with you. My name is Paige and I'm your host, and today I'm sharing a conversation that I had with Kirsten Ackerman, who is uniquely qualified to talk about this really important topic where we're diving deep into this common question we get as dietitians, where people wonder, like we'll often get this question where people will say, well, I really want to work on intuitive eating, but I also have concerns about my cholesterol, or I'm worried about my diabetes diagnosis. So can you help me? You know, a lot of people really kind of believe or assume that intuitive eating is fundamentally different or in opposition to any particular health concerns or any particular medical nutrition therapy that might be necessary for certain conditions. And Kirsten and I both feel very strongly that that's just not the case. And we talk about that today in today's episode. What I love about Kirsten is she is a fierce anti-diet advocate, but she also, her day job is as a renal dietitian. So she works with patients on dialysis and getting treatment for end-stage kidney disease, or end-stage renal failure. I forget what the exact term is there. Anyway, so Kirsten talks about her work and how she uses intuitive eating even with her kidney patients. And I just thought that this was a really important thing to share. So if you've ever wondered, yeah, I'm really interested in this intuitive eating stuff, but I have all these health concerns, and if you felt like you had to pick one or the other, I hope that this conversation will give you a little bit of food for thought, because I really, truly believe that as we use intuitive eating principles and as we connect to our bodies and discover a more peaceful relationship with food, it becomes so much easier to figure out how we need to care for it, whether that's a particular special diet with a certain disease, such as, kidney disease, or whether that's concerns about cholesterol. It's a false dichotomy to say that it's one or the other. So I'm excited to share this with you. And before we dive in, I do want to just remind you of a couple things. First of all, if you'd like to support the podcast, you can do so by clicking on the link in the show notes. And what you'll find there is you can support the podcast for $5 a month. And what you get is 3 extra episodes every single month. So one is a guided meditation, one is a nutrition lesson, and then another is a Q&A episode where I will be exclusively only providing Q&A episodes in that podcast feed, no longer in the free feed here. So if you are able to help support the podcast, I hope that you will do so. And if you can't, that is absolutely understandable and no problem. Another way you can help support is just to leave a review or share with your friends or your family. All of that is really helpful as well. And don't forget, I have lots of online resources for you as well. So please feel free to check out the Positive Nutrition Academy, where I have done multiple online courses, a couple of shorter webinar educational trainings, and these are all uh, self-paced, available whenever, and completely online. So I've done one in a combination with Jesse Hoffman, who has a PhD in nutrition, who's also a registered dietitian. We did a course called Positive Nutrition 101, where we teach about the science of nutrition. I also have one called Positive Nutrition for Life, where I talk about how to create a healthy relationship with food. This is a really in-depth course where I take you through the intuitive eating book and beyond. And then I have a course called Mindful Eating Workshop, where I co-teach that with Noah Rasheta, who's the host of the really popular and really amazing podcast called Secular Buddhism. And my latest online course is Raising Intuitive Eaters. So if you are a parent or an adult in a child's life and you are curious how to extend this information you've been learning about nutrition and having a healthy relationship with food into raising kids, that online training is for you. So to check those out in more detail, feel free to head on over to positive-nutrition.com/academy, and you can find all of the courses and webinars there. Okay, well, with that, let's get into talking with Kirsten, who I just think she's just so fabulous, so well spoken, and I just think the world of her. So I hope you enjoy this episode, and thank you again for all of your support. And I hope all of you are doing great and making it through this challenging time as well as possible. All right, here's Kirsten. Hi, Kirsten. Welcome to Nutrition Matters podcast.
Hi, Paige. Thanks so much for having me. I am super excited to be here.
I'm super excited to have you finally. I don't know what's taken me so long, but here we are. I'm pumped.
Yes. Better late than never.
Better late than never. So introduce yourself really quick so that people can get to know you and what you do, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. So my name's Kirsten Ackerman. I am a certified intuitive eating counselor, and I'm a registered dietitian. I specialize in health at every size, intuitive eating. I have my own virtual private practice, helping people heal their relationship to food through this model. And also I work at a dialysis clinic. So I help people who have end stage renal failure, and they have to come in for these treatments 3 times a week. And I help them, with their nutrition because they have a very specific diet.
I did a rotation at a dialysis clinic as an intern, and it was surprisingly like one of my favorite things that I did as an intern. I love that environment. How do you like it?
That's funny because I feel like many dietitians that I tell that's an environment I work in, they're like, oh, that was like one thing I never wanted to do or whatever. For some reason, there's this like perception of it. I love it. I love that I get to develop a really close relationship with the patients.
Yeah, right.
Obviously, there's pros and cons, right? Like it's a difficult patient population. They're very sick, but also that is one benefit that I get to, spend a lot of time with them, really get to know them. Whereas, in previous positions that I had been in, it was kind of like work with them for a few sessions and then I kind of never see them again. So I do like that aspect.
Yeah, and nutrition is a really big part of their treatment, a part of their lives, and you can be really helpful and develop that like relationship too. Is so fun. You see them multiple times a week.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I'm sure this is something we'll talk about a bit more, but I love, with my approach, with the intuitive eating approach, with the anti-diet approach, I love bringing that into a setting where previously many of these patients, had felt a lot of rigidity in their relationship to food, a lot of guilt and shame in their relationship to food because this renal diet, the kidney diet that they have to follow, can be put through this lens of being extremely rigid. So being able to come in and really make it more individualized and, allow them to like gently heal their relationship to food in that setting has been really rewarding.
Yeah, and that's such a good kind of segue into our topic for the day. So what we want to explore together is, let me see if I can set the stage. So we want to talk about how, like, the questions we get, as you and I are both online, we actually both podcast. We should mention your podcast. It's called Intuitive Bites, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And so we're both kind of out there in some ways, in terms of like, we have we talk to large audiences as we put stuff out there online or on our podcasts, and not saying large audience like, oh my gosh, look at me, but just who knows who's listening kind of thing.
Right.
And when you communicate nutrition messaging to a wide audience, at least I'm interested in your thought process around this, but for me, I'm always thinking, okay, what can I say about nutrition that's going to uh, be helpful, that's going to invite people to think of things maybe a little bit differently, but that's not going to get so individualized that I'm going to confuse someone or potentially like harm someone, right? Like give advice
Mm-hmm.
that maybe would work in one situation but not in another. So I find that when I'm speaking in a podcast format or online, I find that I have to kind of choose topics that are kind of in line with what I just said. But when I'm working with an individual, there's a lot more, potentially like reading and interpreting labs and talking about like more nitty gritty, even nutrition things when necessary. So the reason I'm saying all this is just sort of setting up this dichotomy that a lot of people ask me about, or a lot of people feel. And by the way, this is both coming, like, people can feel this confusion both as dietitians and as like lay people thinking about working with a dietitian. It can feel very confusing, like, who do I work with? Do I want to work with an intuitive eating dietitian, or do I want to work with someone who can help me with my cholesterol, right? Like, people feel like they have to kind of choose between those two. And dietitians might use the language of, do I want to be an intuitive eating dietitian, or do I want to be a dietitian who does medical nutrition therapy? To use kind of a dietitian jargony term there. And I just want to open up the dialogue with you, Kirsten. What do you think about that? Do you hear that concern? What's your initial reaction to that? Let's talk about it.
Yeah. I definitely have had potential clients come to me and kind of, um, you know, approach it as like, I'm not sure if we can work together because I'm, really concerned about my health or like addressing, my blood sugar concerns or cholesterol concerns, but I also want to heal my relationship to food. So it's like, they have this hesitance, like, should I be working with, like what you're saying, like an intuitive eating dietitian or someone who actually, who can directly address my health. So it's kind of this one or the other. And I think that what I always try to shift their thinking to is that, you know, the intuitive eating approach, the health at every size model, this kind of way of approaching nutrition is supportive of medical nutrition therapy. It's supportive, and it can really lay the foundation for addressing these bigger concerns, with our health. I think that for some people, in the short term, the focus may be like when many clients are coming to me, the focus might be let's work on making peace with food and rejecting the diet mentality and kind of working with these intuitive eating principles, because that's kind of where I might start with somebody. But that doesn't mean that our work is limited to that. It also doesn't mean that you can't just go to a dietitian who has an intuitive eating approach and just kind of jump right in and start with you know making shifts in your health that are going to be supportive to in order to address some of these bigger health concerns.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it's not an either or thing. like
For
like
sure.
sometimes people wonder, or when you're consuming a lot of messaging online from dietitians who identify as being an intuitive eating dietitian, it might kind of feel like, oh, all we'd talk about is eating donuts or something like that. Like
Right.
that might feel like that's kind of what it's about. And and I get where people are coming from. Like it can kind of be really tricky to capture all of the nuance and all the different ways that intuitive eating can play out for a person. Again, like I said earlier, I don't always feel comfortable talking about lots of specifics related to nutrition in such a big platform, like who you don't know who's your audience. But I just think that it's really important to point out, at least for me, the reason that I approach nutrition the way that I do is because I found it promotes health the very best. Like that's it's as simple as that for me. Like I'm not approaching nutrition from an intuitive eating perspective just because other people are or it's getting more popular. Like truly for me, it's about this actually really does help people figure out how to feed themselves in a way that promotes their health and well-being. I'm interested to know, like, what's your reason for approaching health and nutrition in the way that you do?
Yeah, I mean, I'm like nodding my head over here completely because I feel exactly the same way. I feel that once I learned more about health at every size, intuitive eating, weight stigma, all of these different elements, I felt like there was no, like in my mind, there was no other option because both from an ethical lens, but also from like a sustainability lens, right? Like something that's going to be effective and really make an impact for people. This was just the only way I could see moving forward, that was actually again going to be supportive of somebody's health. Um, I think that I agree. Like I think that the reason that there is confusion about this, like either or, less like an intuitive eating dietitian or someone who's going to address health things, is because it might be because intuitive eating dietitians and practitioners are online kind of trying to push back against the culture that has all of these harmful messages around food and really wants to, we want to promote a different perspective around food that, again, like you're saying, is going to lay the foundation for, making healthy behavior changes that feel aligned with somebody's values. And again, like for me, like that seems like the only way and the best way, the most supportive way to be helping people.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk about what you might have heard as you put these messages out there. Do you get any feedback of like, oh, this stuff is anti-health?
Oh gosh,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay. What do you want to say about that?
Um, yeah, where do I start with that? I mean, I think that when we come to like when we talk about intuitive eating, I think that there's this perception sometimes that it's anti-health or anti-nutrition because, again, like you said, like it's like there's a lot of like pictures of donuts and french fries and burgers, and it's like, it can seem as though we're just promoting, eating all of these one type of food or whatever, that people don't associate with being quote unquote healthy or like may not be as nutrient dense as some other things, right? So there's this idea that it's just kind of like letting yourself go, like throwing caution to the wind, like falling off track, just not caring or whatever. So I think that because at the beginning of the intuitive eating journey, many people go through that phase of like reintroducing foods that they previously restricted. That kind of gets the highlight reel on Instagram.
I mean, yeah,
Or
like donuts are pretty and burgers are fun to post, right? Like it's and it's a snapshot. You're right. It's a highlight reel.
yeah, and like if you have restricted these delicious and amazing and satisfying and fun foods for so long, and you're fine that you're coming to intuitive eating and making peace with those foods, that is what's going to get the highlight reel, because that's exciting and awesome. But that doesn't mean that that's where the approach ends. That's just one, in my mind, that's one kind of phase, or one piece, element to the process. But people, again, that if that's getting all of the hype, then people can kind of see it as like, well, I'm just, not caring about my health. I'm just eating all of these things and whatever.
Which is problematic in and of itself, right? Like one of the things we're trying to work on in this realm too is neutralizing food, which is another reason why you might be seeing many of the foods that are notoriously like known as quote unhealthy. Like we're trying to just say like, hey, everybody, like it's okay to eat this. Like you have permission to enjoy this really tasty thing without guilt and shame.
Yeah, and without, like you're saying, like without that judgment of, it's like, oh, it's in this category, like I'm being bad because I had this, or I'm having being good because I have this. It's just kind of allowing for that neutralization, which, by the way, is supportive of health, right? So like one of the things that I like to talk about a lot too, and we all like to talk about, is that it's health isn't just physical health, right? Like it is supportive of your health to make peace with food and to release this anxiety around food and this stress around food. That is totally supportive of your health.
That is such a good point. Like health is so much more than what we put into our mouths. And just when we just assume that it's all about nutrition, we actually, ironically, potentially detract from our health and well-being because we make that so important that maybe we're neglecting other areas of our life that also have powerful impacts toward our well-being. So you're so right. Like it's really important in even talking about health to just give a nod to the fact that yeah, like nutrition is part of the picture, but it's not everything. And like what else makes you feel whole and well and promoting of your overall well-being is a really important question for each person to ask themselves.
Yeah, totally. I also think it's interesting to think about, the way that the way we're thinking about food and our perception of food and our relationship to food impacts our behavior around food, right? So like if I just go off and say, well, I'm gonna, cut out this food or whatever, that's a choice. And if you might be thinking that you're coming at it from a health standpoint because of your beliefs about a certain food, or whatever, the beliefs of how that food is going to impact your health. But how does that rule or limitation actually impact your behavior and, again, your mental health, right? Like how is that actually playing out, when you set those limitations? Because through the process of intuitive eating and making peace with food, you're going to find that there are more neutral behaviors around food and more like peaceful relationships, or behaviors around food, that again are going to be supportive of your health because they aren't so chaotic.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Here's another thing that comes to mind that I think will be really relevant to even your dialysis population. When we're talking about health, it's like I am very clear that I'm clear in my like intentions around what I'm trying to do as a dietitian is I am trying to help people access and approach their health and well-being in a health promoting way. But I also really love the conversation going on around the idea that like health isn't necessarily like something that is accessible to every person, and it doesn't mean you're a bad person or a failure if you struggle with your health in some way. Um, and when sometimes it's just a tricky balance to be promoting health and well-being without making it seem like if you are struggling with your health, you've done something wrong or you're morally like inferior to someone else. How does that play out in your dialysis population, and or like how do you feel about that idea of like health is not a moral imperative?
Yeah, I feel super strongly about that as well. And I think you're right that it can feel like a difficult line to walk sometimes, because if you're like, I don't know, if you're promoting health behaviors, especially in the context of our culture, people automatically, feel like there's a morality associated with it. So it's like they might be kind of going down that path, even if that's not where you're coming from. But it is interesting with my dialysis population because, as I mentioned, the the vast majority of them have multiple health issues. And I also think it's interesting just to hear how other providers and people I interact with within that setting, how their perceptions of people's health might be, like, just basically from the perspective of, like, if it's somebody's fault that they ended up in dialysis or on dialysis. Whereas, my hope is the way that I look at it is that there are actually, not even just the way I look at it, the way that it is, is there are so many different variables that lead to somebody being in that chair, right? Like, having, chronic, unmanaged, uncontrolled diabetes or hypertension or something like that, whereas someone might look at it as that's the fault of the individual. The reality is that stress and socioeconomic status and all of these other variables are at play, that are not within the individual's control, right? So we can't kind of assume that somebody can just change, their health status, right? That's not within everyone's ability.
Yeah, and nor does it really matter, right? Like, it's like, okay, here you are receiving dialysis treatment. I'm your dietitian. Let's figure out what we can do. Let's strategize from right here, right now. Like, what can we do to help your nutrition work better for you? Like,
Yes.
why do we obsess so much about, like, the why behind it? I don't know. I think sometimes it's just like that's so unproductive.
Yes, absolutely. And, the way that I kind of approach my work with those patients as well is like, and this totally ties into my work with intuitive eating, is really from the perspective of, like, how can we address, some of these things with your labs or your fluid or whatever to make you feel better in your body and to, improve your quality of life, because that's the goal here. So kind of going at it from that perspective of how they're feeling so that they can support their health and that they can show up, better and more fully in their lives and for things that matter to them, feeling well. That's really the goal.
Yeah, I love it. Let's give a couple examples in our work, in our professional experience, of how this kind of misconception of this dichotomy of you're either an intuitive eating dietitian or you're a dietitian who can help with, like, you know, health conditions or certain diagnoses. Let's kind of talk about some examples of just how that's just plain old not true. I'll go first since I'm kind of
Okay.
throwing this your way. um, so I've had experiences where I work with someone with a very particular diagnosis of some type of, I'm going to keep this a little bit vague on purpose, but, like, let's say it's like a digestive condition, and there's, like, cold hard facts from a gastroenterologist. You have this condition, which means we have to kind of look at your nutrition and maybe avoid certain things or reduce certain things. Like, let's say I'm working with someone like that, which, by the way, like, that happens, and that's part of my work. One of my very first things that I'm going to work on with that person is, like, how does it feel to have this diagnosis? How does it feel to have the knowledge that, like, we've got to kind of reduce this certain thing so that you can function better and feel better and live better? But how do we make it so that this doesn't feel like you can't go out and spend time with your friends? Or how can we strategize for this to not, like, take over your entire, like, mental capacity and, like, drive you, bonkers? you A lot of times what I'll actually encourage people to do is, like, okay, what type of practices do you already have in place that help you feel calm and grounded and connected to your body and at peace, what are some of the things that you're doing that are maybe not necessary for your health or well-being with this, that you kind of just have gotten maybe even like hyper vigilant about being aware of bodily functions or about the way certain things are feeling in your body, taking away some of the stress and pressure of like gathering every single piece of data and really just being like, okay, your mental well-being around this is really, really important. How can we strategize to make you feel your best, even though like this whole like medical side of what we're dealing with is like really tough. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I love that. It sounds to me like it's just like starting. I think that what people expect when working with a dietitian related to something like that, it's going to jump into like, okay, let's talk about how we can take this out, take that out, or like adjust this or adjust that. Like it sounds like, yeah, like starting with like meeting the client or patient where they're at and like kind of digesting that information, or working through that information, or really like supporting them and setting them up mentally before diving into other pieces is one way to support them.
Yeah, and I've had experiences where nothing changes with a person's nutrition, but they're given permission from their dietitian to stop doing certain things that are just stressing them out, that are unnecessary. And I've had people come back and be like, oh, I feel so much better just changing that. Right. So the example I just gave was like a medical condition where we have evidence that we need to like look at, you know, nutrition elements of what someone's eating. But there's also cases where it's like, you think something's going on with your nutrition, you think you have an issue with a certain type of food, but let's wait to cut that out or to even talk about restriction, and let's
Yeah.
explore all this other stuff first. And I can't tell you how many clients I've had like that who, we work through sort of like the next right thing together with their health and their nutrition. And a lot of times we don't even ever have to look at cutting something out of what they're eating.
That like rings true so much with me because I've even recently just had a lot of conversations, with potential clients and whatever, that just kind of these food beliefs, like these really deeply held beliefs about like sugar makes me feel this way when I eat it, or carbs or whatever, and it ends up impacting obviously how they're eating. And when we kind of start working together and making different shifts, and maybe just kind of allowing them to eat more consistently, or adding other things in that to balance things out or whatever, like they end up realizing that that wasn't the sugar or whatever wasn't the cause of their symptoms, but it really was just other elements of their eating, or the pattern that they of their eating.
Yeah, and I have to say, of the two examples I've just given, the second one is way, way, way more common. Someone
Yeah.
thinks that they can't eat X, Y, or Z, or and then they start to kind of like cut more and more things out, and they come to me thinking, "Oh my gosh, I can't eat anything. I feel like something's wrong with my body." And like again, like I'm not afraid to take into account what might be medically necessary as far as like nutrition, but at the same time, sometimes it's like more is better, like the more we're going to restrict or cut things out, the worse you're going to feel mentally, physically, emotionally, socially, all those different ways. And so sometimes the quote unquote nutrition intervention ends up being some nutrition education about like, hey, when you restrict, this is the natural response, whether that's medically necessary or whether that's like something that we're just putting on ourselves. Our bodies and minds don't really know the difference. So we want to work through that first.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally. Um, I think that, with my population with the dialysis clinic, it's interesting because for them, many of them, it is obviously that's a situation where it's medically necessary to be limiting certain things, not having too much of certain things in order to stay healthy. But I think that even though that's the case, I think in so many ways I've been able to go in and, again, like give them that individualized, like, let's look at your labs, let's really see how things are going, kind of approach, and be able to loosen the reins and like allow them to not be so restrictive, which just makes them so much more at ease, and they're really surprised by that approach again, because I think that so often they've experienced, and even from practitioners that weren't dietitians, just other people that are present in the facility, the kind of like shaming of like, oh, this person has this food with them today and that's bad, so I yelled at them. So to be able to like you do that work around just like allowing some flexibility really that's aligned with their own personal situation, it has been really freeing for them.
Yeah. And do you find, like you said earlier, that looking at that, like looking at our approach to food often ends up yielding far more health promoting behaviors. Do you find that being true with your population of kind of rather than saying, "Oh, that's food bad, that food is bad, let me chastise you." Do you find that kind of taking the approach you're taking actually helps people settle into a better groove with their special um, limitations with their dialysis?
Yeah, I think so. I think the biggest thing that, I'm kind of impacted by is just like it's almost just like the way that they kind of like loosen and like their kind of like the shoulders, what am I trying to say? Shoulders going down, like they're very, just like I said, like very at ease with this approach because they're not used to it. But it opens them up to consider, you know, making choices that are going to feel good for them rather than
Yeah.
being on the defense. And, which I think that's what often happens when people are coming at them with kind of restrictions or shame.
Yeah, like how often do you see it where people are eating certain foods? Maybe they don't even really want it. They just kind of want to put the middle finger up to someone who's told them that they can't have it, right? They're like, screw you, I'm doing this, right?
Absolutely. I feel like that's like just a natural response to, again, to rules and restrictions or those external, like, this is what you should do. Okay, well, then I'm not going to. I'm going to go really far in the other direction. And I do see that so much with these patients because, again, they have a lot of restrictions thrown their way. And, there are many cases of them just being like, oh, yeah, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I don't want to. I love my, tomato sauce or whatever. I'm not going to do it, and I don't want to talk to you about it.
Yeah. Okay, this actually seems like a really good time to tell you one of my favorite stories that I tell my clients all the time.
Okay.
And this often comes up in context of explaining to, like, trying to kind of educate someone who's sort of newer to this stuff what the power of restriction is on our psychology and on our behaviors. So so when I was an intern in this dialysis clinic, and just to kind of set the stage, dialysis patients, among other things, need to eat in a low potassium way just to help their labs and help their body function best. Um, so as the dietitian, you go around and you look at labs and you talk with the different patients and kind of strategize about, I mean, and correct me if I'm wrong. I know you do this.
Yeah.
I didn't do this very long, so tell me if I'm saying anything wrong. But you talk with them about what's going on, and you help them kind of strategize about next steps and what they can do and all that stuff. So I was talking with these patients, and one person in particular had some really high potassium levels, and I just remember this so clearly. He was like crying, like actual tears were coming down his face. And he just said, you know what? I just want to eat a banana. Like, I just
Oh,
want to eat bananas, you know?
yeah.
And I was kind of hit like a ton of bricks with that. Like, I, I enjoy a banana here and there, but I've never cried about it, like I've never felt so much like I wanted to eat a banana and so almost like quote unquote tempted by a banana because there's no restriction on bananas for me, right? It's like, have it if you want, don't have it if you don't, like whatever. It's not emotional. But what hit me so hard is any food can become that kind of, it can increase in our draw to have it when we are restricted from it. So, the common thing we restrict is I don't even need to mention them. We all know the foods that we commonly restrict. Part of why we might be so drawn to them could be because they're delicious, but also could be because we've restricted them or we've decided that they're wrong or bad. And there's so much power in that restriction.
Yes. Yeah. And like alternatively, there's so much power in like in allowing permission. And that's like one of the most rewarding parts of working with people is like that aha moment when they're like at first they're like, I don't know if this is going to work out for me. Like, I know you say it works for, whatever, this has this impact on other clients, but I can't imagine that happening with me and my fear food or whatever. And then that permission in and of itself, just knowing, okay, it's like fully available in the kitchen. I can have it whenever I want, whatever, like really takes away part of that draw, that appeal, especially that like the chaotic appeal to it. But with the banana thing, it made me think of what you said before about like regardless of if it's medically necessary or if it's just a self-imposed I'm going to cut out this food, your body responds the same way, your mind responds the same way, and that can feel traumatic and it can feel really like powerful regardless of the purpose behind it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. What other examples do you have from your dialysis experience that could kind of help to sort of give people a picture of kind of this non-dichotomous view of like intuitive eating versus medical nutrition therapy? So you've mentioned permission is super powerful and you just see kind of people just feel more at ease and feel just happier and like this, okay, I can do this. Is there anything else that kind of jumps out at you of the power of approaching things from this perspective?
I mean, I mentioned this as well, but I think like really as often as I can you know, drawing it back to how they feel in their bodies. So one thing that dialysis patients, have to be mindful of is their fluid intake because fluid ends up kind of building up in their bodies because their system isn't working properly. So if they're drinking a lot of fluid, all of that fluid's going to stay in their body and it's going to end up putting pressure on their heart because their heart has to pump all that extra fluid. So um, if rather than approaching it as okay, you're coming in with all this extra fluid, you obviously drank too much, that's terrible, you should really cut it back, like stop doing that. Through the intuitive eating lens in my approach, I really try to draw it to how are you feeling in your body, like how is the extra fluid on you like feeling, because many times people will experience kind of like shortness of breath and like it's difficult for them to walk across the room or they just notice having that extra fluid on. So drawing it to that. I also use like the motivational interviewing approach with my clients, so I really try to allow them to guide the conversation.
Yeah.
But we focus obviously on the labs and the fluid as well. So if we're talking about fluid, that would be kind of one way that I'm bringing it back to their own bodies and their own experience.
I love that. And that's so powerful. That simple question of like, how do you feel? This idea of like connecting to your body is really powerful. And you asking them the question of how does that feel with that extra fluid on you? That feels so much more empowering than saying, oh, okay, you clearly drank too much water. Don't do that anymore. Um,
Exactly. Yeah. And that's my intention with the labs and other ways as well. But yeah, with the fluids are a really good example of that. But having that connection to their bodies, allowing the feedback that their body is giving them to guide them rather than some external variable, right? Like, which is what dieting and diet culture is so good at, is kind of having these external rules. Well, you're only supposed to have this much fluid, period. If you didn't do that, then you failed, period, done. Like, don't do that anymore. Whereas this connection, really allowing people to connect with the feedback of their own body, um, hopefully will snowball to them, just being more in their bodies in general, and honoring those that feedback more often.
Yeah. So, in other words, like connecting more to your body's own sense of own wisdom rather than always just giving away all your authority to some external diet, even if you have some type of diagnosis that might feel like, oh my gosh, no, I can't trust myself. I need to just follow these rules. I hope that people are just hearing like there's a lot of power in connecting to what your body's trying to tell you.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Instead of looking at it from the lens of like, okay, these are the rules, whatever, like trying to make those connections to what what you're feeling in your body. But there are other variables, like other labs that we look at. Like one in particular I'm thinking of is phosphorus levels. That is a little more nuanced, and people can't always experience the effect of high phosphorus, and in fact they often can't. So from that perspective, or from with those variables, trying to bring it to a larger perspective of like, what are your goals? Like what are your values? What's important to you? And then, if it's something like, I want to be around for my family, and I want to be able to really spend a lot more time with them, and be feeling good and not be in the hospital and have, different complications or whatever. If that, is one of their values, then we can kind of approach managing their levels from that perspective. But also, this can go to a wider picture with other disease states as well. But with dialysis and with phosphorus levels, rather than looking at it as just as, okay, we need to restrict these foods, we can also look at it as, okay, you have the option of taking more of this medication that will allow your phosphorus levels to be better controlled, but you'll need to take more of it. Or you can kind of work on adjusting the phosphorus foods that you're taking in, right? So there's this option of choosing what works best for that patient, rather than just simply the only option is restriction.
Yeah. Yeah, and choices are the best. It's really tough when you feel like you have no choice.
Yes.
And that's part of what we could be reacting to when we're reacting to restriction, is just feeling stuck or feeling like you're in a corner and you don't have any choices. So I love that. I think that's also the job of a savvy clinician, is to try to kind of say, okay, here are your choices. Here are, like, let's be creative in how we're looking at this and how we're like coming to like solutions together.
Right. Right. And again, yeah, and again, like the choices is putting it in the patient's or the client's hands, which will allow them to make the best choice for themselves, and also again make them feel empowered by whatever it is that they choose.
Yeah. I love that. Okay, so is there anything else that you would want to kind of mention as far as this idea of, or this common misconception people have, that health at every size is anti-health, or intuitive eating means that you are not able to help people with various disease states or diagnoses? Is there anything else you'd like to mention there?
Um, I guess just to like, yeah, just like in sum, like the intuitive eating and health at every size approach can just support health overall, and it can support any managing of different types of disease states. It's not this like, it's not in a box. It's simply kind of a platform that can go many different ways.
Yeah, it's a framework that can inform the clinician. It's a framework that can kind of help support your health, but it doesn't need to be in conflict with with nutrition recommendations or with medical recommendations, it can support those.
Yes.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, so tell us, well, I want to ask this question, but I'm not sure if I even can ask. I know you've announced that you are writing a book. Is there anything you can tell us about that? And by the way, huge congratulations. That is such a big deal. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very excited, also very deep in writing these days. But I can definitely tell you like just kind of a general thing about the overall vision, I guess, for the book is really I think that I've heard a lot from different clients, prospective clients, just people out there that sometimes they feel kind of lost in how to apply some of the intuitive eating principles and how to really like practically do that in their lives, when it comes to things like grocery shopping or, something that often gets co-opted by diet culture, like meal planning or something, right? So my concept and my kind of idea behind this book is to kind of give a little bit more structure and guidance, and allow for more tips on that practical application. So I'm hoping that it will give people, a little bit more structure within something that sometimes can feel a little out there. So
yeah, that I have to say, like that feels like that's meeting a huge need because that's a really common question I get too is like, wait, so am I allowed to have any type of structure with this or am I doing it wrong if I have like a meal time or like if I plan meals or if I'm, people can sometimes be like, okay, theoretically I understand this, but how do I do it? So that's awesome.
yes, exactly. Yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think that we so often when people are coming from dieting or having all of these rigid rules around food to intuitive eating, there's this common conflict of like, well, now I don't have these the rigid rules and structure and I'm kind of just out there floating around and it's super uncomfortable. And part of that is like part of the healing and realizing that we don't need to attach to that control. But at the same time, I think that part of the purpose of the intuitive eating framework for people in my mind is to kind of bridge the gap and like to give some structure along the way as you're healing and kind of releasing that control. So with this book, I'm hoping, to just kind of give a little extra structure to that as people are healing.
That sounds amazing. I'm so happy for you. When does it come out?
It should be sometime in the summer of this year.
Okay.
So pretty soon.
Yay,
Yeah.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, where can people find you and follow along with your work?
So I am mostly on Instagram at the intuitive_RD, like registered dietitian. And I also have my Twitter, which is the intuitive RD, and my podcast, Intuitive Bites, and my website, which is just theintuitiverd.com.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining me and thank you for exploring this topic. I've been wanting to talk about this for a long time and I'm really happy we can put out something to kind of help people think more, in a more nuanced way when they're thinking about who would I want to work with or what do registered dietitians do? What's a intuitive eating dietitian versus a different type of dietitian? What am I going to get from this person versus that person? And hopefully it helps people understand like there is this balance of anyway, we said it well today, so I don't need to go through it again, but I'm just glad we were able to talk about this.
Yeah, me too. I agree. It's such a big need and I hope it really resolved that for some people. But thank you again so much, Paige. This was really fun.
Well, I sincerely hope you've enjoyed this conversation. If you haven't already, please go ahead and leave a review on iTunes. Thanks again so much for listening, and we'll see you soon for another episode.